Anticipatory grief is the grief that one feels about losses to come, so losses that one is anticipating. Now that may be one's own death, or it may be the death of a loved one, but it can also be all of these other losses. And so for young adults whose mindset is appropriately focused on the future and moving forward with things like education and employment and relationships and life milestones, it's quite hard to think about a future where one might not be alive or where one might be worsening in terms of disease progression. And yet, those thoughts can plague a person, and we try hard to help them understand the feelings that they might have about those potential losses. So anticipatory grief is what I call grieving in 3 time zones. It's distinctly different from grief after death. And it's sort of the simultaneous experience of grieving where one is now. So if one is experiencing losses of capacity, losses of fertility, losses of connection to work or to social life, one's grieving those losses. One's also grieving what one was like in the past. So a person with capacity, a person who worked, a person who was financially independent, a person who was free to see friends whenever they wanted, a person who was physically perhaps in better condition. And then one's also grieving the loss of a future that may not come, or wondering what will come in a future that certainly will look different from what they anticipated. And so they're sort of having to deal with emotional and physical responses to losses in each of those sort of time frames. There are 2 features that distinguish it from grief that occurs after a death. So one is that people experience the rehearsal of the death, in that they're imagining the death to come or imagining the loss to come, and they're kind of going over that and almost experiencing it or imagining it in their minds. And there's also the attempt to adjust to the consequences of the death. The mind and the spirit and the person are trying to work through what is it going to be like after this loss or after this death occurs. And it may be for themselves if they're the client facing terminal illness or disease progression, or it may be they're worried about the loved ones and how they'll adjust to the consequences. So those are 2 primary aspects that differentiate anticipatory grief from grief after a death. And that's a profound amount of disruption to one's emotions and one's physical state. So it can include things like anger and frustration. It can include sadness. It can involve some joy, a lot of lament, some regret, some hypervigilance, so feeling on edge. A lot of people think that grief is an emotional response, but it's really the full physiologic and emotional response to loss. So physical symptoms can include real disruption to sleep. One can become very severely insomniac. One can also develop an excessive amount of sleep. So disruptions to sleep in any way are quite common with grief. Another area that gets hit quite often is appetite. So people may find that they have no appetite and they're losing weight. They really don't experience hunger when they're grieving, or they may experience the reverse where they're eating a lot more. So it's important to monitor for these signs and symptoms, which can also be aspects of side effects to medication and disease progression. So we just remind people that this is all part and parcel of the grieving process. And then there's physical symptoms: muscle tension, gripping in the stomach, a feeling of nausea or queasiness, a feeling of nervousness. In the same way that one can be hypervigilant from trauma, one can be hypervigilant with grief. And so one may feel that uneasiness in the gut. And one can even experience things like diarrhea. So very real physical symptoms: fatigue, feeling on edge, keyed up, not able to settle, not able to relax, in addition to the sleep-related issues and appetite that we had talked about. So it's important to me to get the word out about grief because I feel like our culture doesn't talk about it enough. And I think giving it a name for a lot of our young adults is really important because it at least makes them feel like, okay, this is a thing. What I'm experiencing is not me going crazy, it's actually real. And what my loved ones are experiencing, my parents, my partner, my children, this is all a very real experience that we in psychosocial oncology and palliative care deal with quite a bit.